Okay, well, take two. So this when there's certain people in Mormonism whose shadow is just absolutely outstanding. You can't get around it. You can't avoid them. And I think Nibley's one of those guys.
Well, for sure. One of the things I do, I conduct the Southern Utah Heritage Choir here in St. George. It's St. George's version of the Tabernacle Choir, right? The church doesn't sanction that outside of the Tabernacle Choir, but it's a large adult choir, and we do songs of faith, and we tour and stuff. We number between 150 and 200 singers. So last week, as I was preparing for this, I just did an informal straw poll, in between songs. And most of them are LDS.
Okay.
And I said, who? Please answer me this. Just shout out who you think it is. The single greatest scholar of the Restoration. And voices from everywhere. Hugh Nibley.
Was there another name? I mean, like realistically,
No.
was there another name?
No. And I keep thinking about that. And as renowned as he is, I would say most Latter-day Saints don't know who he is. So I was kind of surprised, but not surprised that so many people would, shout that out. And they knew. And I had many of them in the group who knew him, who had classes with him, or had some connection with him somehow. And the other thing that impressed me as I listened to your podcast, and if I remember correctly, at least 3, maybe 4 of your guests cite Hugh Nibley and quote Hugh Nibley and refer to Hugh Nibley as having had a life-changing influence on their lives. And I have to say, and I'm one of those people, we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I got so excited about preparing this, as excited, I think, as I was about giving a presentation on Joseph Smith and his influence on the world, which was, I felt honored to be able to extol what he has done in that way. And I caught myself, I'm like, wait a minute, Joseph Smith was the prophet of the Restoration, right? Hugh Nibley's not. Why am I so excited about Hugh Nibley, right? And it's because of the incredible impact that he has had on my life personally. And it's what's really interesting, as I was reviewing these materials, I've been reading and studying Hugh Nibley since 1982.
Jeez.
That's like, 42 years. And as I read over again some of the stuff that I read 42 years ago, which is still relevant, still mind-blowing, what I learned about myself is that the person I am today, the way I think, and the way I perceive God is shaped in a very large measure by some of the teachings of Hugh Nibley, which, by the way, they're not new. We'll talk about what his role is relative to the Restoration. But for people like me, I immediately connected with how his testimony, how he thinks, and how he learns and how he studies. And it's been, I fully credit him, among others, but mostly the top of the list, Hugh Nibley, with my own personal steadfastness within the restored gospel, because of how he has framed the doctrines, the teachings, and the principles of the gospel, and how it helped me understand it better, more deeply, more fully, and more profoundly.
Yeah, and the other thing about Hugh is that in many ways he's above the fray, right? Like he gets away with things that not many other people get away with, right? And I think that's because they knew who Nibley was at heart, but also because his scholarship was impeccable. There's just no getting around it. Um, when you think of the greatest anything, right? Basketball, Michael Jordan, right?
Yeah,
Quarterbacks, Tom Brady. Mormon scholars, Hugh Nibley, right? It's right there. He is the greatest. He has set the standard, and I'm not sure that standard will ever be reached again.
I think I would agree. And what's really crazy about what he did, the breadth of his scholarship, the depth of his scholarship, the volume of his scholarship was done at a time when he did not. I mean, computers were not a thing.
Right?
He
Right?
was typing this stuff out on his Underwood manual typewriter and going back and forth to libraries everywhere and making little 3x5 note cards to remember all of his citations.
Whew.
And his citations are so numerous that the end notes of an essay or an article are longer. They're more pages than the actual essay. That's
That's
how
a
thorough he was in it.
that's a man who could have benefited from copy and paste.
I was one of the funniest things. I was in 1997. Uh, to my knowledge, it was the first time there was a digital LDS library on a CD-ROM, if people remember those, right? So on
Okay.
that one CD-ROM, you'd buy this one CD-ROM for like 20 or 30 bucks. And suddenly you had digital copies of 1,500 texts. And you
Wow.
could search them all in seconds. It was amazing. And now they still have stuff like that. Most of it's online now. I think what's it called? Link, can't remember it now. Gospel Link. Gospellink.com. And they have many times that now, 1,500. That's online. I haven't accessed it lately. I hope they're still going. Um, but one of the people they specifically asked to review the LDS Collector's Edition 97 was Hugh Nibley, amongst all of these other notable people. Now, in 97, Hugh Nibley would have been 87 years old. You know
Wow.
what he said? One sentence. I wish I'd had this 40 years ago.
Oh, I bet. I bet. You know,
Could you imagine?
there's something in surveying that a lot of surveyors do. So everything's laid out in mile squares, right? And
Right?
in the old days, to break down a section, shoot all the monuments on those mile squares, it took you a good solid, probably 3, 4 days, right? Well,
Wow.
now with GPS, we can literally do a section in hours, top,
That's amazing.
right? If they're
Yeah.
well monumented, we can find them. And oftentimes, when our satellite array is all messed up or something like that, we'll say, "Yeah, those are former surveyors. Like, not on my watch. You don't get to do it."
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but anyway, all right, dude. Let's dive into the presentation. I think I gave you sharing permissions already, so you should be ready to rock. There, it's coming. Aw, young Hugh and old Hugh.
um, as I was thinking about how to frame this presentation, um, the question occurred to me, why Hugh Nibley? Why am I so obsessed with this man? Wasn't really famous, wasn't notorious. Within his circle, he is a legend. But why has he meant so much to me? Why are we talking about him on your podcast? Why did God choose him? All right. Or you would ask Nibley, why, Hugh Nibley, did you do all of this stuff? And so I wanted to present the facts of his life uh, as partial answers, at least, to those questions. If you
Got
look at his lifespan, born in 1910, died 2005.
almost
Consider what,
100 years old.
yeah, lived a very long time, a very productive life. His last few years were were bedridden just because he was 95. In any case, he witnessed First World War, participated Second World War, was in his prime when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. was in the premier position to report on the rediscovery of the Joseph Smith papyri, and so on and so forth, which we're going to talk about. But why are we talking about Hugh Nibley? In a nutshell, it has to do with this: the collected works of Hugh Nibley.
Wow. How many volumes is that? Is that not
19.
Jeez.
19 volumes. And these are not, the one in the middle is the biggest. Tinkling Cymbals Sounding Brass. That's over 700 pages.
Jeez.
These other fat ones you see there are over 600 pages. So these are essentially everything, almost everything that he's done, for almost a total of 10,000 pages. And this is not just him compiling stuff. These are original essays on an incredible variety of topics. When we meet next time, we're going to go over, just to gloss over so people could see. He's a bona fide, called a polymath. It's a genius who's a genius in all types of categories. Like Leonardo da Vinci was a polymath. He was a great artist, a great scientist, all of this stuff. This is Hugh Nibley. Like you, I've tried to think, is there anyone else in the history of the restored gospel, or in history, period, who has produced 19 volumes, 10,000 pages of original thoughts, essays, research? And I personally can't think of anyone. It's really quite amazing.
When he's the kind of guy where, if you're at a party or something and you're like, well, I'm working on this and I'm working on this. He's the kind of guy that comes along and says, I'm working on this, and this. And you're like, I've got nothing, right? Like, you're a stud. I stink on ice. Good for you, Hugh. I mean,
well, here's the funny thing about him. If there's anything he hated, it was self-promotion.
right.
He didn't do this for self-aggrandizement. In fact, he's not the one who published them. He served clearly as editor, chief editor. But we'll talk about the key resources and the key people that God brought into his life to make this possible. I've tried to consider, in terms of numbers, the number of people potentially who have been affected positively, as I have, by his works, and it would have to number in the millions.
Right.
And you'll see that his whole life was really about making this happen.
Yeah.
Really quite amazing. Now, for your listeners, there's a web address underneath the photograph. You go to that web address and you can download, free of charge, almost all 19 of the volumes. For some reason, they don't have 18 and 19.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know why. One Eternal Round and an Approach to the Book of Abraham. I don't know why that's on there, but I'm sure you could probably find it somewhere if you looked. But free PDF downloads. And the wonderful thing about the PDF downloads is it's a searchable database.
Yeah.
And so if you're researching something, you just do word search and away you go, and you can do it in minutes.
Huh.
Something
That
that Hugh
makes it
Nibley couldn't
nice.
do.
Now,
Anyway.
there's no excuse for ever a bad sacrament talk at this point, right? I mean, at this point, you can go get some Nibley and you can get some fascinating stuff. Just make sure you quote, you recognize the man in your talk, right? Quote your source. But at this point, there's no more excuse for real crappy sacrament talks. You've got plenty of material now.
Now, as if this wasn't enough, the other things that we know that he has produced, Timely and the Timeless, was a book that predates the collected works of Hugh Nibley by about 5 or 6 years.
Okay.
Although I think almost all of those essays are now included in the collected works.
Oh.
Of course, his teachings of the Book of Mormon, semesters 1, 2, and 4 semesters, those are also published. You can get a hold of those, and teachings of the Book of Abraham. He more so than any other person I'm aware of, specifically published scores of articles for the Ensign or the Instructor or whatever it was called in the previous iterations of the official church magazine by request. And they were series that he would publish. And I didn't put here, but imagine in 1957, when the church published the instruction manual for the priesthood quorums, they asked Hugh Nibley to do it.
Wow.
And it's now, the book is now, it's called An Approach to the Book of Mormon. An Approach to the Book of Mormon.
That was
That
originally a Melchizedek priesthood manual.
that was the priesthood manual for 1957. Apparently, he would send the drafts off to the committee, and the committee rejected every single chapter because he thought it was too demanding and too hard. The president of the church at the time was David O. McKay, and they were complaining that it would make the core members have to reach too much. And President McKay's response was, "Let them reach. That's what we want."
Nice.
You can imagine
Nice.
that, right?
Yeah, oh, that's awesome. You know,
Now
as
this,
far as his magazine publications, I can only imagine that that somewhere there was an editor of that church magazine going, you know what, we're short. We don't have enough. Call Hugh, right? He's got to have something cocked and ready.
yeah, it's possible, but I think a lot of it has to do with this final category, an unknown quantity of research for church leadership. Starting in 1946 through 1986, when he was 76 years old, the first presidency in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles repeatedly made requests of him for research that he would present to them in private meetings. In the early years, 1946 on, it was apologetic stuff. His first one that he did voluntarily was a response to Von Brody's "No Man Knows My History," which he called "No, ma'am, that's not history." And apparently, the church went on to continue to request more defensive articles to defend the reputation and history of the church. And he was very, he dutifully did it, but he didn't enjoy doing that as much as he did doing his original research.
You
And I
know,
think it was like, go ahead.
when I get on the other side, when everything's all done and wrapped up, I'm going to ask the Lord for one more interview, right? I'm going to like, give me one more shot. I want 3 hours with Nibley, right? Please give me 3 hours with Nibley. And because I can only imagine if you had him sequestered for 3 hours where you could ask him questions, can you just imagine the amount of knowledge that he could pass on in that time? It would be astounding.
And when he taught and spoke, it was like stream of consciousness. It would just start pouring
Right.
out because he had so much in his head. And what he was just really, really good at was synthesizing all of these disparate sources and materials from different places in history and times and making sense of it all, which is one of the reasons the authorities of the church would rely on him, because his ability to put that stuff together and draw sensible conclusions, as we'll see next time. The two other ones that we know of, Elder Dallin Oakes of the 12 Apostles spoke at Hugh Nibley's funeral. He gave the eulogy, if you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
He gave the eulogy because he had been friends with Hugh Nibley for 50 years. He was Hugh Nibley's student at BYU, when, if you can imagine.
Whew.
And then Dallin Oakes later became a BYU president, and so they had that relationship. And he related at the time at the eulogy how impressed he was. The presidency in First Quorum of the 12 asked Hugh Nibley to prepare a presentation discussion of the atonement. And so at a certain place in time, he met the presidency of Quorum of 12 and others, presumably, and
Right.
spoke about it. Could you imagine that? And speaking about the atonement.
No.
But probably the most curious one to me, in 1985, he was asked to present information regarding the ancient temple rites. And by that time, there had been a very significant number of ancient texts. How many? In my book, they occupy 50 pages of material,
Holy
50 pages of
cow.
ancient texts that detail temple ordinances that only endowed Latter-day Saints
Right.
get. We go, oh, I know what that is. So they asked him to present on that. And in 1986, he met the first presidency in the Quorum of the 12 in the Salt Lake Temple for a 3-hour meeting. And presumably in the temple, there's nothing you couldn't talk about regarding
Right.
temple rites. At the conclusion of the meeting, he gave them each a longer printed version of it called The Development of the Temple.
Ooh.
And it was not long after that the alterations to the presentation of the endowment were made. Was it 1990, 91, something like that?
90. Yep. Wow.
So, yeah, wouldn't you like to be a fly on the wall? And
Yeah. Yeah, because quite frankly, like, because we've brought him up before, almost on every one we've done, but the one that really stands out to me is the one we did last December, where we were talking about Joseph Smith and the cause, and Mormon cosmology and the Egyptian endowment.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so this is a guy who had a different view on the endowment than the rest of us, right? We understand, or faithful Latter-day Saints understand, that it's ancient in origin, but Hugh Nibley was the first one that put that on the map.
Well, for sure. And I can't tell you what that has meant to me and my own personal testimony, my witness of what is true. And this is, people have heard me before. I am a doubting Thomas. It's just my brain. That's how it works. It's just, to be honest. And to completely buy into what occurs in our temples is so different from what goes on in the rest of the world, by and large,
Right.
that for me to go in there in full faith and participate in full faith, I have to be pretty secure in the fact that these are authentic. And
Right.
thanks to Hugh Nibley, amongst others, and the discovery of these ancient texts, I know for a fact that these rites that are performed in the temple, these ordinances, are at least as ancient as Jesus Christ and before. Like, some of those accounts are Jesus Christ himself
Right.
being the officiator, teaching his disciples and their wives things like the prayer circle and signs and tokens and stuff like that. And when
Right.
I read that, I just melt. It's like, okay, I believe I'm in.
Yeah. Yep.
It's real.
Yep. And Hugh Nibley is one of those guys who, I think, for the first time ever in Mormonism, during his ministry, right? And I will call it a ministry, right?
Yeah.
I understand that he was paid by BYU, but the work that he did far far exceeded just normal scholarly work, right?
Oh my
So,
goodness.
so his ministry was probably one of the first that appealed to the head as much as the heart,
Oh, for sure. Oh,
right?
there's no question. I mean, Joseph Smith did in
Right.
all of
Yep.
his working, but Hugh Nibley was first and foremost a scholar.
Absolutely.
And so that's how he approached his assessment of the restoration of the gospel, which is, yeah. Um, well, I wanted to interject here. One of his daughters, in speaking at his funeral, said that the work that he was most proud of, he said to her, was his anonymous work. That stuff in that bottom category that we talked about, that he
Mm.
cannot take credit for. Which makes me, I even want to know even more what that was.
Do we
That he
know, do
was,
we have any idea where that was published, what that was?
Well, I get the three ideas that we know that he did. He did, defending the faith early on and probably throughout, the atonement and temple rights. Beyond that, we're only guessing, and it is not published. Some of it has been published, and we can only guess, like Temple and Cosmos and stuff like that would contain some of that. So,
Why do you think he went anonymous on some of those?
because it was not for public consumption,
Okay.
perhaps because of its sacred nature.
Okay.
Neil Maxwell, when he was encouraging Hugh to publish on the temple, he said, you really need to publish this stuff. Just be careful about drawing too many conclusions for people."
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay.
Oh, yeah, probably that.
Okay.
And the funny thing is, as you said, he's above the fray. Um, one of the reasons, I mean, because there were many scholars at Brigham Young, many good scholars, but why was he so implicitly trusted? And Elder Neil Maxwell, who was an apostle, now dead many years, but in the 1980s was saying that was never a question with Hugh Nibley what his motivations were, because his entire life, everything he did was a testament of his commitment. So he said that was never in question. Can we trust him? Is he doing it for the right reasons? He said all that was left was to figure out what he was saying.
Wow. It's
And
quite.
so that's pretty amazing. In addition to his published legacy, this is a photograph of Daniel Peterson. If I had to point my finger at any living scholar and say, this is the person that has inherited the mantle of Hugh Nibley, or at least in part, I would say this person here, Daniel Peterson.
Okay.
Because administratively, what he has done, he was highly instrumental in administrating farms. And when farms later went into the Neil Maxwell Institute, but then there was kind of a coup that occurred in the Maxwell Institute, which changed it from instead of a more defending of the faith organization, turned it into more of a politically correct academic
Mm,
exercise. And so
gotcha.
what Daniel Peterson did, he founded his brand new, the new version of Farms, which is called The Interpreter.
Right.
And oh my goodness, they're publishing amazing stuff. And they're also responsible for movies like the movie about the Book of Mormon witnesses, right?
Right.
That came out. So he has been super busy. He's also a polymath in that he's super well read. He knows a variety of languages and is able to defend the faith on many, many different fronts.
Gotcha.
So to quote him, as he talks about Hugh Nibley, is significant. He said, to do apologetics, defending of the faith, is a covenant responsibility for those who are in a position to do it. Is it really? Did we make covenants to defend the faith?
I think so. I think it's implicit, right? And in that taking his name upon us, I think it's implicit there, right? I think not only do we take his name upon us for our own personal growth, but I think also you're basically signing up to be a representative, right?
I remember
And
very, oh, go on.
part of that would be to defend the faith that
Yeah.
Jesus lays out.
Yeah. 14 years ago, I was just surfing the internet on Facebook, and a friend who has become disaffected with the church was being quite vocal about it, public about it online. And I thought, gosh, somebody should get on there and at least give the other side of this anti-Mormon propaganda. But I
Right.
don't have time to do that. And you know what popped into my head? Alma at the Waters of Mormon.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
stand as a witness of God at all times, in all things, in all places you should be in, even until death.
Yep.
It was so strange. And so I've spent many late nights responding as straightforward and as politely, and it's not personal, just at the very least, so people can make an informed decision about what they're reading.
Absolutely.
Anyway, it is. It's a covenant responsibility. He goes on to do it well as a scholarly obligation. To do it with charity is a Christian ideal. Hugh Nibley did it, and he did it well. He did it with a humorous alertness to human foibles that he was also entirely willing to direct at himself. I loved how he could laugh at himself. He judged the works of others as he judged his own. Of course, one thing that makes our situation different now is that we have a lot more people with varied expertise. We have teams of scholars now.
Right.
Hugh Nibley had to do it all by himself. In his day, there was only one Hugh Nibley, and he didn't have a lot of support.
Wow.
So for the better part of 30 or 40 years, he was the Lone Ranger of LDS apologetics, taking on all comers
Hmm.
and doing it quite well. So the other side of that, this man we're looking at here is John W. Welch, otherwise known as Jack Welch. His claim to fame, why he's an attorney from California, and he's taught at Brigham Young University, taught law. I want to go back for just a second. I forgot something. There was a point in Hugh Nibley's career at the University of Brigham Young, probably about halfway through his tenure, I'm guessing. He came back from a sabbatical, I think at the Chicago Institute, and he went to the administration. He said, I don't want, because he'd been teaching history and languages and some religion.
Mm-hmm.
And he said to them, I don't want to teach languages and history anymore. I just want to teach religion.
Hmm.
Which is very interesting to see how his priorities shifted and what was really important to him as time went on.
Do we know what the catalyst for that was?
I don't know if it was a specific catalyst. The purpose of his sabbaticals was to learn Egyptian.
Okay.
And he started learning Egyptian for reasons he didn't understand. He just felt compelled, impressed, inspired to do so.
Okay.
So he started learning Egyptian, and this is this is a man who already speaks 13 or 14 different languages and who can read 24 languages.
Hmm.
And now he's taking up ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics.
Wow.
At the age of age 50, where most of us are slowing down.
Phew.
And he didn't know why until 1967, when the New York Metropolitan Museum donated the Joseph Smith papyri to the church. Fragments of the papyri from which, presumably, the Book of Abraham was translated. And so he was perfectly prepared at that time to jump in, to assess them, to say what they were, and to mount a discussion of that on behalf of the church at the church's request. And what's really amazing, they were, I think, donated in like November of 67, and by January, they were already publishing Hugh's responses to the discovery of those papyri. And I understand in those days, before the computer, it would take that long just to publish the General Conference talks.
Right.
They were publishing all of this. That's how important it was to them. And he was in a position to do that. Anyway, Jack Welch's claim to fame, and I want to say, I think, as much respect for Jack Welch as I do for Hugh Nibley.
Wow.
Were it not for Jack Welch, we wouldn't have the collected works of Hugh Nibley.
Okay.
Because of his expertise and his devotion, he was able to make that happen. And the thing I really love about, I heard him speak once, never met Hugh Nibley, but I did hear Jack Welch speak, and he's the kindest, humblest, most unpresuming. Here he is speaking about life-changing doctrines, and he's doing it, he's not pounding the pulpit, calling down fire from heaven. He's just telling it straight up, presenting it humbly. His single greatest claim to fame, he is the one person in all of the earth that discovered chiasmus in the Book of Mormon.
Okay.
Chiasmus is the plural of the word chiasm. A chiasm is an ancient Hebrew writing style. The Hebrews were very well trained in their writing styles, and they had a number of techniques that they would use to try and accentuate aspects of teaching their religion. They're called Hebrewisms. We now know that the Book of Mormon is stuffed with Hebrewisms everywhere, every sentence. And it came to pass as one of the most common ones. And how, when you read it, it seems like a little bit awkward English and things are worded backwards, that sort of thing. Those are Hebrewisms. That's how a Hebrew would speak if they could speak in English, right?
Interesting.
Chiasm is probably the more complex, I would say, yeah, the most complex Hebrewism I'm aware of. Chiasmus is a form, it's a reverse parallel structure. So let's say I was telling a story that had 5 elements.
Right.
One, I would talk about 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. And then I would repeat those in reverse order. 4, 3, 2, 1 again.
Okay.
That's a chiasm. So Jack Welch was on his mission in Germany in the 60s, early 60s, I think. And he and his companion were going to a Bible study class hosted by a Lutheran pastor. And it was a fairly new academic study, the discovery of chiastic structures in the Bible, which is evidence that it was written by Hebrews. That's awesome.
Right.
These two missionaries are going, this is awesome. Hey, I wonder if there's some in the Book of Mormon. So they went home, and lo and behold, they found chiastic structures in the Book of Mormon. Little ones, big ones. And they went back and they knocked on the pastor's door, and they said, is this what you're talking about? And the pastor said, that's a particularly beautiful example. That's a wonderful chiasm. Where did you find it?
Yeah.
And when they told him it was from the Book of Mormon, he slammed the door. And that was it. Well, so Jack Welch, there is one chiasm in the Book of Mormon in particular, which is the largest and most flawless chiasm known in history, in all of literature. It's Alma chapter 36. In Alma chapter 36, Alma the Younger is which son? Helaman? I can't remember. He was recounting the story of his conversion to one of his sons because he was telling it after the fact and how all this time to think about it. He expressed it in the form of a perfect chiasm, which had 17 elements.
Wow.
So he told a story of what happened to him, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 17, and then reversed 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, back down to 1 again.
Wow.
The whole chapter is this giant chiastic structure. In a sacred chiasm, what is one of the key elements is that the pivot point in the middle, where it turns and goes backwards, usually centers on deity or Christ. And in Alma chapter 36, that is exactly what happens.
Wow. Alma 36.
Alma chapter 36. And what I would encourage people to do to discover for yourself is really amazing. The versification of that chapter does not match the chiasm. Why? Nobody knew it was there.
Right.
Joseph Smith didn't know it was there, right? Grandin, the printer, didn't know it was there. Howdry, nobody. Nobody knew it was there for 130 years.
And that's not the only one in the Book of Mormon.
Oh, no. There are many, 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 many. Yeah, I don't know how many. I mean,
I'm sure.
I have my favorites, but
Yeah, I'm sure it's a coincidence. It's fine. Just move along.
in any case, uh, if you look at chapter 36, start in the first verse and start in the last verse and find the matching words. And you will find this stair-step pattern until they get right up to the point where Christ changes him.
Interesting. Holy cow.
That's amazing. Yeah. So that's Jack Welch. He's the guy who did that. His claim to fame now, the influence that Hugh Nibley has had numbered in the thousands because they didn't have the internet. Jack Welch now, he's the head cheese. Let's call him that, behind scripturecentral.org, Book of Mormon Central.com, Evidence Central, Pearl of Great Price Central, all now under one house, Scripture Central, on that website, which has thousands upon thousands of informative explanations and straight up evidences of the truthfulness of the restored gospel.
Wow.
And he does a weekly podcast for the gospel doctrine curriculum. He's retired. I don't know how old he is. He's got to be 70s, 80s, but
That's
and yet
impressive.
it's never about him, but he's just so devoted and so constant.
Right.
Okay, talked off. This is what he says about Hugh Nibley, which is critical for us to understand in terms of where the gospel is today. Although he, Hugh Nibley, has not walked down every hallway, he has gone along opening doors which others will have to walk through for many years to come. And when we meet next time to talk about all of his teachings, you will see that he opened hundreds of doors. And he did more than open. I mean, he did some walking, and so what that means is now, because of him, and because of nearly every Latter-day Saint scholar today was a student of his or influenced directly or indirectly in some fashion by him. And I include myself.
Okay.
My efforts in my publication to try to make sense of the hundreds of extra canonical writings is a direct result of my studies of the writings of Hugh Nibley. He pioneered that.
Right.
And I could only imagine what, with the resource, the resources that I have today would have required a team of a dozen scholars in his day, because they didn't have the computer. And I often wonder, I often wondered myself, I wonder if he would like my book. I wonder if he'd like it. Yeah, I have to.
I think so.
It's right down his alley. You'd have to love it.
I think so. You know, where Hugh was initially the guy who, look, I don't want to say open doors. In some ways, I think Hugh Nibley kicked down those doors, right? Because those weren't doors that anyone was excited about opening, right? And Hugh Nibley just was like, well, we'll do it anyway.
Well,
And
consider this. Yeah, go ahead.
And you got to respect that kind of just throwing caution to the wind. I'm engaged in a good cause, come what may, and go for it.
Yeah. Yeah. And what we don't recognize fully, I don't think, at the time in which he lived, he was, talk about a pioneer.
Yeah.
He was talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls before any of them had been published.
Right.
The Dead Sea Scrolls were, for example, discovered in 1947, and he began talking about them in the 60s, less than 15 years later, before all of them had even been translated.
Right.
I mean, talk about a pioneer. So he was talking about and drawing conclusions from and synthesizing information from documents that were only just barely being translated, and some of them translated by him because they didn't have English translations yet. So the conclusions he was drawing, honestly, are still way ahead of his time.
Wow.
Still relevant. Anyway, that's a photograph of Dallin Oaks, former president of BYU, dressed up as Cosmo. I have to wonder what he thinks of that photo. He said Hugh Nibley's humility was also evident in his disinterest in acquiring disciples. It was never about him. Admirers, helpers, and supporters he had in abundance, but they were always unsought and unbidden. Truman Madsen, another great LDS scholar, late great Truman Madsen, perceptibly notes when it came to disciples, Nibley sent them on to the only one who deserves disciples.
Mm.
So when we talk about what qualified Hugh Nibley to do what he did, a very big part of it was his humility. It was
Mm-hmm.
never about him. It was always his motivations were true.
Right.
We'll talk some more about why that is. We all have roles to play in one another's lives. Sometimes it's just introducing us to various things. You know, two of the people in this photograph.
Mm-hmm.
That's me in the middle. I was on my mission in the Japan Fukuoka mission, the Southern Island, back in '82.
Look at the young, strapping Ken Peterson in that photo.
Yeah,
Destined
look at
for
that.
greatness, destined to write a book about Mormonism and the Apocrypha.
And that is the Yamada family, wonderful family that we were meeting with. Husband was at work, as Japanese guys do, and
Yep.
kids. Uh, my companion that I have my arm around, his former wife, it was on your podcast not too many weeks ago, Cheryl Bruno.
Oh, okay. All right. Yep. Yep.
Cheryl, so this is Joe Steve Swick III.
Okay.
So Joe and Cheryl and Nick Latursky co-authored the book about Freemasonry. What's it called? Relaying the about Freemasonry and the
Right.
history of the Temple Endowment.
Fascinating
Uh,
conversation that was.
the reason this is important to me, uh, and the reason why, regardless of what happens to any of the people involved, I will be forever grateful to and indebted to Joe Swick, Elder Swick, my companion. He's the one who introduced me to Hugh Nibley.
Okay.
And not just to Hugh Nibley, but to FARMS, the Foundation for Ancient Research Mormon Studies, which represented Mormon intellectualism at its finest in those days, which is exactly what I desperately needed uh, to live a steadfast, faithful life.
Well,
And it was because of him.
we
Yeah.
talked about that the first time you and I ever talked, right? When we first talked about your book, Mormonism and the Apocrypha.
Yeah, yeah.
By the way, I can't recommend it highly enough. You should go buy Mormonism and the Apocrypha.
Mormon Doctrine in the Apocrypha.
Mormon Doctrine and the Apocrypha. That's right. Beautiful book. For so many people, well, I'll let you tell this part, right? Because you realized early on you were a little different, right? From most
Yeah.
people who were at church with you. In what way?
I think I first picked up on this. I mean, when you're a kid, you only know what you know, your perception. I was not much older than 5, going to my Sunday school class, and it's my first conscious memory of hearing the account of the first vision. And my natural response to hearing the first vision was to doubt it
Mm-hmm.
because I had a friend across the street who'd make up stuff like that all the time,
Okay.
make up stories to get attention. And I thought, oh, I know what Joseph Smith was doing. He was just trying to get attention with his fancy stories, right?
Yeah.
So that I'm not a naturally believing. I've always I don't know why. It's not because my family's this way. My siblings aren't necessarily this way. I'm a natural born skeptic. Maybe it's because of my early exposure to. There are a couple of guys in this town that I grew up in that they were just big fat liars, always telling whoppers, trying to impress it, stuff like that. And so I just grew up not trusting, not taking anybody at their word,
Mm-hmm.
really, unless I knew them well and I knew what they stood for and all that sort of thing.
Right.
So, being a natural born skeptic, it was critical for me to have enough information, evidence, if you want to call it that, to subdue my skepticism, to overcome my skepticism, so that
Right.
I could know what was true, what was not, right? And Hugh Nibley was that for me, among others, and farms, and later the Maxwell Institute, and now the Interpreter, all that sort of thing. And I can say quite confidently today that my reasons for living as I live and pursuing and trying to be a faithful Latter-day Saint are based on, well, Elder Holland called it thousands of evidences of the
Mhm.
truthfulness of the Book of Mormon and of the restoration of the Pearl of Great Price, the Book of Abraham, the Book of Moses. I mean, in Doctrine and Covenants, the prophecies of Joseph Smith, and the fulfillment of those prophecies in the latter days. I can't, it's not that I want to sin, or I actually like being a Mormon. I enjoy it, and I enjoy associating, affiliating with other good Latter-day Saints. I like being that. Um, but there's a certain strength and a commitment and a fire that comes along with having an undeniable knowledge of the truthfulness of what Joseph Smith was trying to tell us.
Right.
So anyway, Joe Swick, I understand he's in a care facility now. If I could, I'd run up to him and just give him a hug and thank him
Hmm.
for what he is meant to be in his life. And I understand that we've crossed swords a couple times since online because we don't necessarily agree. Doesn't matter. It doesn't change what he gave me.
Right.
And and okay, I've gone on too long about this, but
No, no, I think
I
good because it's how Hugh Nibley affected you, right? And we all have those stories. I mean, certainly with me, I mean, gosh, I'll relate something personal. My younger brother, who's 2 years younger than me, when I told him I was going to become a Mormon, he kind of picked up the Book of Mormon, you know, the Freeburg paintings that are in there.
yeah.
And he's like, so you're telling me that there were like Romans in ancient America, right? And I'm like,
Yeah.
not really Romans. I can see how you could think that based on,
Yeah.
but he's like, okay, so let me get this straight. An old dude from Israel got in a boat with his family and sailed over to the Americas and lived there. It's like, yes. And at the time, I had nothing to back that up, right? He would say,
Right.
how could you believe that? Right. And all I
Yeah.
could say was, I just received a witness of it. That was it. Right. It wasn't until somebody introduced me to Nibley where I was like, oh, I wish I had this 4 years ago. Right.
Yeah. Your story reminds me, Dan Peterson's father was not a member or an active member all
Mm.
the while Dan was growing up until he went on his mission. And his father finally read Hugh Nibley. I don't recall exactly which book it was, but he finished reading the book and he asked his missionary son, Dan, who later baptized him. I mean, no doubt a good and a very rational human being who, like your brother, was like, how can you believe this crazy story? But after reading the facts of history as presented by Hugh Nibley, it causes a doubting Thomas, like myself, and like Dan Peterson's father, to say this: is it, could this actually be true? I mean, sometimes the story is so fantastic that until you read the facts of it, your mind, it doesn't even occur to your mind that it could actually be fact, that it could actually be real,
Right.
until you read the convincing facts of history that bear it out. And I saw, I, like me and like Dan Peterson's father and like you and millions of others, I'm quite sure, we're grateful to somebody to break it down for us like that and to do that work. And oh, I forgot to, let me see if I can find it real quick. He Uh, oh, 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 well, let's see. I hope I can find it now that I've thought of it. His motivation for doing this, he realized what his research meant to so many. And I think a lot of it was driven because he was teaching these college kids and they had all of these questions for him. And, oh, nuts. I haven't found it. But let me paraphrase then. He he loved he considered it a privilege to be the one to help answer people's questions. He loved doing that, and he took it as a personal responsibility. And that was, you can see that's part of his success, that he was doing it from a place of righteousness and a place of
Right.
charity. Okay, so what Nibley is to me then, as I have here on the slide, he's the expounder for me. An expounder is a person who explains. So like the weird language stuff in the Book of Mormon, he explains why that is and how that actually turns out to be an inexplicable evidence of its veracity.
Right.
I mean, it's a truly an ancient record. All right. Uh, I put together this brief timeline of significant events in his life that, in my view, shaped him, prepared him to be the witness and the expounder that he became. His grandfather was Charles Nibley. In 1907, his grandfather, Charles Nibley, was made presiding bishop of the whole church by
Okay.
Joseph F. Smith. 1910, Hugh Nibley was born in Portland, Oregon, where his father was working on one of his grandfather, Charles Nibley, was at one time the wealthiest man in Utah and had 3 wives, practiced plural marriage, and eluded authorities and nearly was imprisoned.
That's Hugh's grandfather.
Yeah.
Okay.
1921, the Nibleys moved to Los Angeles after the sugar beet farm that his dad was working on went out of business.
Okay.
In 1925, the grandfather, Charles Nibley, is chosen by Heber J. Grant to be the second counselor in the first presidency. It's one of the few examples in church history where a counselor was made a counselor without having been an apostle first. Went from presiding bishop to second counselor.
Was his grandfather kind of wired like Hugh? Was he a scholar as well?
I don't know that so much. I don't know that what I've read about the grandfather Charles Nibley is it very, very kind. All of his employees just flocked to him because he just loved everybody. And he loved Hugh Nibley and he loved the family and always very generous. He liked having money because he could give people things. And he
A
really
true
liked just
capitalist.
and I have it on another slide, but Hugh Nibley's great grandfather on his grandmother's side, Charles Nibley's first wife, Niebauer, was the very first Jewish convert to the restored gospel.
Oh, wow.
And the very first dentist in Utah.
Holy cow.
So let's see how close Hugh was. And we'll read more about Charles Nibley, but his grandfather, Charles Nibley, would tell Hugh stories, personal stories of his interactions with Brigham Young. All right. So right away, we see that he has an inside look at church authority and church leadership. He knows them personally. He's seen them in action because they would come and visit the first presidency and others. And so Hugh saw this, and that had a great influence on him, which we'll read about in a minute. In 1927, when he was 17, he receives his endowment in the Salt Lake Temple in preparation for his mission. In 1927, consider the year, he begins to serve his mission in Germany. pre-World War II
Post
Germany, and
World War.
serves to 1929
Wow.
when we think he was poisoned. It was very, very sick and ended up going home a little bit early.
Do we
Uh,
do we know the
huh?
story behind how he got poisoned or why he was poisoned?
Yes. Um, some native Germans, they were trying to give him some soup or something. He was like, no, thanks. And they were insistent. No, you have to. We made this for you. He did, and he got violently ill and was throwing up, and he was sick for quite some time. So he thinks he may have been poisoned.
You know, it's interesting to note that during this time in Germany, it's very hedonistic, right? This is when the cabarets come on the scene. Um, it was kind of a calculated move, right? They wanted to keep the Germans fat and happy because they were printing money at an exponential rate to pay the war debt from World War One. And so Hugh going to Germany, it's not like the Germany that we know today, which, kind of embraces its Lutheran roots a little bit.
Right.
This is a Germany that is very hedonistic in its
We'll
and
talk about his mission.
and I imagine that Hugh must have for well, it must have been difficult because of what was happening in Germany in those days.
We'll talk in some detail. His mission president, when they got there, told them, he says, I imagine you boys will return here in uniform in about 5 years.
Holy cow. Called that one right.
And and he loved his mission president. And his mission was so difficult because of the hedonism, the atheism, and just it was the harshness of the people. And you can blame, there are a lot of things to blame, the Versailles Treaty and how hard it was in Germany, or just hyper nationalism or what have you. It got so bad that their tracts, their pamphlets, he threw them away. And he started preaching hellfire, damnation,
Ooh,
warning them of destruction, like the prophets of old would. Like we were just reading about Samuel the Lamanite in Gospel Doctrine today. And then you call the people to repentance. And when they fail to do that, the role of the prophet is to warn them.
right.
You're not repenting, you will reap destruction. And he preached that they would be destroyed by fire from heaven. Hugh Nibley did, and
Wow.
was chased out of a town by a butcher's wife with a meat cleaver. And we'll get the rest of that story later. So it was not a good mission, and he did not speak highly of the German people, which was a disappointment to him because as academic we prize the German universities,
Yeah.
Heidelberg, some of the first universities. In 1934, after he gets back from his mission, he graduates with his bachelor's degree in history from UCLA. In 1934, he attends graduate school at Berkeley and meets a guy named Paul Springer.
Hmm.
And Paul Springer, the reason he's important to me is the things that he and Hugh learned from each other. Paul Springer and they were housemates, and they were completely different. The only reason they were put together is because they were both geniuses. He was a straight up good Mormon boy. Paul Springer was a hard charging partier, womanizer, if I could put it that way. He was a black sheep.
Gotcha.
Despite which they became best, lifelong, inseparable friends.
You know, probably one of my best friends, I still talk to him, is kind of the same way. The dude, he's way smarter than me. He's got a degree in physics, but he's married now and settled down. But in his younger years, he was hell on wheels, right?
Yeah.
I was always pretty straight laced, and by the time I met him, I was pretty straight laced as well. It's funny how those sometimes can be some of the best friendships. Maybe because
Yeah.
we are so different. Um, I remember kind of another thing that makes me think of this is you know those times when you're sick and you can't sleep, so you go downstairs and you sleep on the couch so you don't wake
Yeah.
anybody else up. I watched an old movie in black and white, and It was about a doctor who was very religious and then a lawyer who wasn't, kind of a partier, that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
it kind of followed him throughout life. And if anyone else knows the name of this movie, please drop it to me because I haven't seen it since and I really want to watch it again. But it follows them through their life and it follows them till they're old men. And the lawyer's kind of on his deathbed. And the doctor comes over to visit him and he finds him reading the Bible. And he goes, "Oh, you going to accept religion now while you're on your deathbed?" And he goes, "Nope, just looking for loopholes." And
Yeah. Well,
and
this
so sometimes those make for the best, most interesting friendships for sure.
it was so. I mean, these two, their favorite thing to do was get together and argue. They loved it, and they gave each other hell. I mean, they would rib each other incessantly and constantly, wrote each other faithfully throughout the war. I mean, and we'll get to the rest of that story, but oh my gosh, it just makes me laugh when I think about the both of them. Anyway, in 1936, God personally intervenes in Hugh's life by subjecting him to a near-death experience, which I believe and others have witnessed was a pivotal moment in preparing him and purifying him to be able to do what he did for me and so many others.
Before we move on to this slide, you don't need to go back, but I got to know. Hugh doesn't spend a lot of time in what we would refer to as the Mormon bubble, right? He's
Correct.
outside of that. He's born in Portland. He lives in Los Angeles. He goes to Germany on his mission, goes to UCLA for school, goes to Berkeley. I mean, what effect do you think that had on Nibley as a scholar being outside of the Mormon bubble?
I think, well, I think that's a very significant influence in preparing him to be in the world,
Mm-hmm.
which to be this type of a scholar, you'd have to be in the world without being of the world. I mean, and for sure that was necessary for him to do what he did. And I think it's part of why he and Paul Springer got along so well because uh, Hugh could love and befriend a guy who's completely different than him. I mean, the thing that put them together was they were both in this Arabic class. They're like the only
Okay.
two people in the class.
All
So
right.
for sure. In 1938, he finishes his PhD. 1939, he becomes a lecturer at Claremont College there in California. 1942, he leaves his lectureship and enlists in the Army as a private.
What inspired him to do that? Because that seems like because he's a scholar, right? I mean, he's already got his PhD, but then goes and enlists in the army. Now, if you were in academia, wasn't that kind of a pass to a certain extent?
I don't think it was in World War II
Okay.
unless you're married, but in his case, he was a pacifist, hated war.
Mm-hmm.
This is such a very interesting thing. He hated war and he enlists and participates and did his duty diligently. Um, I think part of it was because he knew he was probably going to be drafted anyway. So just pull the trigger, make it. And make it his own choice. Plus, most Latter-day Saints growing up in the Book of Mormon, you believe that the United States is the promised land, you
Right.
know? And so I'm sure there's a great deal of patriotism involved, I would guess. So he gets in the military and he tests very, very high and he's fluent in German. And so they sent him to, they were called the Ritchie Boys. They were trained in intelligence gathering. Many of them were being trained, the German speakers, as interrogators. Nibley was not very good at it. He didn't
Okay.
like he didn't like forcing people to say things they didn't want to say. So he ended up going, they call it the German Order of Battle Intelligence. He would gather intelligence to help make battle plans,
Okay.
which later on in the war, and this is an unbelievable true story, he was stationed. on the front lines at the time of the Battle of the Bulge, which came as a surprise to the Allied forces, but not to Hugh Nibley. He told them it was coming, and they ignored him.
Wow.
And then when it happened, his commander was like, "Yeah, you were right."
Wow.
In 1944, he is attached to the United States 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, quite famous, and ends up driving one of the first Jeeps onto Utah Beach on D-Day.
Wow. Whew.
And they had to waterproof their Jeeps because the landing craft would land, I don't think it was like 100 yards or something off the beach. And the water was, I don't know, 4 to 6 feet deep because
Right.
the beach extended that far out into the shallows. So they'd waterproof their Jeeps so that they could drive them underwater onto the beach. And so he was responsible for waterproofing his own Jeep, and he had a bunch of guys riding on it, cheering him on, "Go Nibs, go." And he just kept driving, water up to his neck while he was driving. And he said during that time, what was going through his mind was elephants in the Book of Mormon.
That would have been hilarious, right? Like if some guy riding right next to him is like, "Hugh, you seemed awfully calm. What were you thinking about?" "I don't know. Elephants in the Book of Mormon. What were you thinking about?" Right?
You know, and their jackets had all these pockets, and in one of his pockets, he kept a copy of the Book of Mormon.
Interesting.
Talk about a Mormon boy, huh?
Yeah.
In 1944, after a successful D-Day, generally speaking, he and the 101st Airborne participate in the invasion of Holland. And what the airborne units would go in behind enemy lines to stir things up and gather intelligence. And it's quite dangerous. And they weren't paratroopers. They would go in these gliders,
Oh,
non-powered. These gliders would be towed up in the air by, I think, C-47s, which would average about 55 miles an hour.
oh, geez. Not exactly an elusive target.
Oh my gosh, it was like a death trap. And the horrible thing about those gliders that went into Holland, the gliders themselves weren't terrible. They had like skis, like skids that they would land on.
Jeez.
As they were going over the ocean, going into Holland, a significant number of them fell out of the sky as they were being towed. Hugh found out years later, while he was still stationed after the war in Germany, he was around some British soldiers that were drinking and laughing, recounting how when they had assembled those gliders, and they didn't know that he was one of the guys in the gliders. They were laughing. They were so drunk that they forgot to put all the pins in when they were assembling the gliders.
Oh,
Anyway, so that was Montgomery's plan. I think it was like the dagger, the dagger, and it was failed essentially because Montgomery wasn't that great of a general.
yeah.
Sorry to any British friends. 1945, Hugh travels through Europe. Oh, I spelled that wrong. Through Europe at war's end and returns to the United States because he was unmarried. He didn't have priority when the war was over to go home.
Mm,
He got a Jeep and he just toured Europe. He
wow.
what was I gonna say? And his superiors really didn't stop him because he was so valuable as an intelligence officer.
Hmm.
One of the places he went, the Eagle's Nest, is an infamous
Yep.
mountain hideaway where Hitler and Ava Braun, I think was her name, that he later married, would hang out. He drove up there to the Eagle's Nest after the war, and nobody was there. They heard somebody run off, I think the caretaker, and had left his coffee or something, and they found some beautiful stationery that said "From the desk of the Fuhrer," which he
Interesting.
took a stack of that home with him.
Huh.
All right, uh, so he gets back from the States, and those guys were subjected to indescribable atrocities.
Right.
And there was no such thing as PTSD diagnosed in those days. You were shell
No.
shocked or just get over it, and most of them did. His therapy when he got home, he loved nature. He loved hiking, taking his kids out for hikes. He and Paul Springer go on hikes. And his favorite place to hike was southern Utah,
Okay.
Pine, Bryce Canyon, and all those places. He went out and lived in Zion for, I think, months to help him recover from the trauma of what he experienced. He was in Dachau, I think, 2 days after they were liberated,
Oh.
concentration camp. All right.
You
So
know,
the very next year,
hang tight.
yeah,
That shows kind of a self-awareness, right? That he knows he's not quite right. And he goes out to work it out, right? Um, it's one thing to go through that and receive help, right? But sometimes you're unaware that you need help, right? Or that there's something off.
yeah,
This shows something about Hugh Nibley's mental prowess, that he in a certain way he could detach and just look at himself and say, yeah, there's something not quite right here that needs worked out. Um, do we have any records from his time kind of hiking and in the desert?
not really. I
Mm.
mean, other than he would write letters to Paul Springer, and
Okay.
Paul would join him on some of these treks, and he would admit that's why he's there,
Interesting.
to heal what he
Interesting.
had witnessed. And we'll talk more about that in a minute also. But um, he comes back and he starts working for church publications under John Widsoe,
Mm-hmm.
and he publishes his first um, apologetic work, No Ma'am, That's Not History, the response to Von Brody's No Man Knows My History,
Right.
and people loved it. I mean, it's like the first time anybody just openly came out and said, yeah, this is horrible, and this is why, and the Latter-day Saints just lapped it up. They they have needed that, right, for many, many years. Um, Widsoe was so impressed. Widsoe contacts the BYU president and says, you need to hire this guy. They interviewed him, and sure enough, they hire him. He becomes an assistant professor of history and religion. And BYU is easy to make fun of. And I didn't go to BYU. I could have, but I'm kind of glad I went the route I did. Not because I hate BYU, but in 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 the case of Hugh Nibley, it was critical. And we'll
Mm-hmm.
talk about why that is. That same year, he meets and he marries Phyllis Draper in the Salt Lake Temple. So all of these elements that we're talking about here were critical in his development and his success as a scholar. And Phyllis Draper was most certainly that. Not only supportive, but she actually enjoyed some of that scholarly work. Together, they had 8 children.
Wow.
In 1955, they buy their first home near the Brigham Young campus, and that's the only home they ever owned together. They live in it until his death, 2005.
Holy cow.
Very humble.
Yeah.
There's a photograph of it. I don't know if I put it in here or not. Parked by the house is a 1976 Datsun. That's
Wow.
the car he drove for the rest of his life. Oh, that's just to show you the kind of a guy he was. Somebody was complaining the bushes are all overgrown in front of the house and the lawn's a mess. That wasn't important to him. Somebody complained about the length of his grass, and the story goes he staked a goat out in the front yard to eat the grass. In 1966, he takes a sabbatical to continue his studies in Egyptian at the Chicago Oriental Institute, and they offer him a position. They're the second ones to have offered him one, and he turned them down. They offered him more money. It was certainly more prestige, but he realized he had a work to do, and that he was doing. In 1975, he retires from BYU, continues to teach a class, and keeps an office there well into the 80s. In 1983, Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies is organized by Jack Welch, primarily to publish Hugh's collected works. In 1984, Hugh had quadruple bypass surgery performed by President Russell M. Nelson of the church.
Uh,
I'm glad it worked.
yeah.
In 1985, First Presidency in the 12 asked Hugh to report on the history of the temple. In 1986, he reads Temple to the First Presidency of the 12 at a 3-hour meeting in the Salt Lake Temple and delivers a longer written report, Endowment History. And in 2005, he dies. Between 86 and 2005, I think he was he was slowing down to be sure, but he was primarily occupied with editing his 19 volumes of his collected works.
Do we have any record of what was in the temple document there to the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12?
And there's nothing about the meeting that's published. I mean, I don't imagine such a thing would be. I imagine a lot of what was presented we'll find in Temple and Cosmos.
Okay. All right.
But I'm like you. I want to know.
I want to
a
know
copy
what's
of
in
that.
there. I promise I won't tell no
there.
one else. I'll keep that under my hat. I swear. I'm good for it.
So here's his great grandfather, Alexander Niebauer.
Okay.
First dentist, Jewish, and the first Jewish convert to the church. This is a photograph of his grandfather in the middle, Charles W. Nibley, flanked by Joseph F. Smith on the left and William Lund on the right, who's assistant church historian.
Okay.
It's a lot of history it's standing right there.
It's spanning a lot of history, right?
Now, the significance of these relationships in how Hugh Nibley was to function in his life is as follows. This comes from his biography written by his son-in-law, Boyd Peterson. Hugh's testimony of contemporary church leaders has been a result, and I would say a direct result, of his personal associations with them from an early age, beginning with his grandfather, Charles W. Nibley. First, the presiding bishop and later a counselor in the First Presidency to Heber J. Grant, Charles Nibley frequently visited Hugh's family both in Oregon and California, usually accompanied by other church leaders. During those visits, Hugh witnessed firsthand their imperfections. It's not what you would expect.
Right.
He witnessed how they would sometimes cheat at golf. Gasp. How their political beliefs occasionally overruled their religious duties. And how they sometimes disagreed with one another. Gasp. Hugh could, now here's the critical point for me. Hugh could not be disillusioned by the action of church leaders because he was never illusioned to begin with. From a young age, he saw them as real people, not infallible popes.
Right.
Going on, he knew they were human. He also heard his grandfather tell inspiring stories about his encounters with Brigham Young. And boy, he's a great fan of Brigham Young, as we'll see later. He saw a compassionate Joseph F. Smith, personally nurtured the needy and grief-stricken during his visits to Oregon. That speaks volumes of a person, right?
Right.
And he came to respect the variety of talents, interests, and pursuits of church leaders. As a BYU faculty member, Hugh accompanied at least 3 general authorities to state conferences where they encouraged parents to send their children to BYU.
Wow.
By the time I was going to college in the 80s, they had reversed that because BYU was stuffed to the gills. And they said, you need to stay home and attend your local colleges. His firsthand experience with Spencer Kimball, then an apostle, showed him the conscientiousness and unpretentious attitude of men whom Hugh came to see as servants of the Lord. His experience with Spencer Kimball affected him very deeply. They were doing this tour. They were down in Arizona. They'd just gone to Spencer Kimball's home state, Snowflake.
Yep.
I think Arizona, and they were on their way home, and the train was going to leave in a few minutes. So he ran off to a bookstore, bought an armful of books, ran across the field, and got on the train. And as they took off, Spencer Kimball's asked him about the books. He got there talking about it, and without even thinking about it, and this is Hugh describing the event. Spencer Kimball grabbed this silk white kerchief out of his coat pocket and bent over, sitting across from Nibley, and bent over and started wiping the dust off of Hugh's shoes. And they
Hmm.
didn't, there were no comments or anything like that. And that, for whatever reason, that's deeply affected Hugh Nibley, that this apostle would do that for him.
Interesting.
Anyway, so that impressed him greatly. And I think that's why and I think he had a great empathy for church leaders, having seen it from the inside.
Right.
This was after he had published his, you would think, he published probably the deepest doctrine, uh, Melchizedek priesthood manual in the history of the church.
Right.
And you would think he'd be the one trying to champion all that. No, he said he had great empathy for the leaders of the church who are duty bound to teach the fundamental principles of the gospel over and over again to as many people as they could, even though they might want to do something else. So
Right.
here's the magnanimous nature of Hugh Nibley. Even though he had his head in the clouds, he recognized the absolute necessity of teaching all these new converts the fundamental principles, milk before the meat.
Right.
So anyway, I thought that I didn't know that about him initially. Very interesting contrast. Hugh's intellect. In 1920, when he was in school in Oregon, the principal at his elementary school gave all of his students an IQ test. He was 10. After seeing Hugh Nibley's high scores, the principal decided to privately tutor Nibley, meaning he took Hugh Nibley out of class, took him out of school, and
Wow.
taught him at home.
Huh.
You couldn't get away with that today.
No, no.
And as an older professor and scholar, this is how he was perceived by his colleagues. He was presenting a paper on Enoch at a conference. He read his paper on Enoch at a morning session of the conference, but it was during the questions and answers where he's just shooting from the hip, answering people's questions. That little by little, the amazing knowledge Hugh had was revealed to every attendee, because he'd start quoting things in different languages and stuff like that from memory.
Right.
At one point, a scholar by the name of George McCrae, a professor of religion at Harvard, commented, amazed, quote, "It is simply obscene that a person knows this much."
Wow. Wow. Who was George McCrae exactly?
Professor of religion at Harvard Divinity School.
Wow.
Somebody said, I read once they said he was the dean, but
Holy cow.
that's significant. And he's not the only one to have noted that, of course. That's a picture of Hugh Nibley at 16, just a year before his mission.
Hmm.
So we talked a little bit about his mission and how that influenced his life.
Right.
When he arrived in Germany, things weren't going so merry. Our mission president was a marvelous man. And in the first meeting we missionaries had with him, he said, I won't be surprised to see all you boys in uniform in another 5 years.
Holy cow. A mission president nailed that.
And he goes on, he says, all along the Rhine, the river, in those villages, it was hard. It was grim. Toward the end of my mission, I threw away the tracts and everything else and just started crying repentance, telling them they would be destroyed by fire. During a conference in Karlsruhe, I went and tracked right by a big church on the main street. There was a butcher shop there. And I went to it and started giving my voice of warning that the people would be destroyed by fire from heaven. Can you imagine doing that on your mission?
No. No.
Your mission president would say, "Hey, buddy, come here. You need to stay in the
Right.
office for a while." And a gigantic Hessian woman had a fit. She ran to the back of the shop and came out waving a huge meat cleaver and said, "Don't you tell me we'll be destroyed by fire from heaven." So I moved on.
Mm.
Here's the rest of the story. Late one moonlit night, this is after the Germans surrendered. He was driving around Germany. I was driving his colleague Van Patten down the main street in Karlsruhe, past the big church in the bright moonlight. The city was all in ruins, and it had all just been wiped out by firebombs from the English planes. They
Hmm.
just smashed the whole city. Suddenly, I jammed on the brakes and ground to a halt. Van Patten said, "What's wrong?" There was the framework. There was the framework of the door to the butcher shop where I had preached back in 1929. So 15 years later or so. It was the butcher shop where the woman came out raving and waving the cleaver and yelling, "Don't you tell us we'll be destroyed by fire from heaven."
Hmm.
All you could see was the framework of the door there. The old butcher shop was in complete ruin. It had been burnt out totally. Fire from heaven had destroyed it. We went to Pforzheim, which is nearby, and the whole town had been firebombed. There was nothing left. A town of 80,000 people. And the mayor there told me that in the last fire raid, 30,000 people were burned to death. So they got fired from heaven, all right.
Wow. You know what's interesting? Looking at the difference of the pictures between the two.
Yes.
I mean, they
Yes.
look like different people.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
the second picture tells the story. If you look at the eyes, that's a dude who's seen some stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a photograph of him and his young wife and their first child, and he looks even older. It aged him tremendously.
Yeah.
So there he is at grad school. And that photograph is of Paul Springer on the left and Hugh Nibley on the right with the hat on.
Okay.
And there they are, probably in Zion or something.
Right.
1947. This is Paul Springer describing Hugh Nibley. Hugh, of course, was a walking jigsaw puzzle. He was then a grad student, and I met him because he was the only other student in the university dumb enough to take classical Arabic. We became very close friends. And then prior to World War II, we made a number of trips to the canyons in Utah, Capitol Reef, the Arches, and of course Zion and Bryce. And on those long walks, we had many, many interesting discussions. We usually disagreed, which is, of course, the thing that made it interesting. Paul later recalled how one time, after considering the way Mormons actively proselyte, he asked Hugh why he hadn't tried to convert him. Hugh replied with a wink, "Well, the church has some rights in this too." Paul added, "I couldn't help but agree with him." I mean, uh, Paul, they would write letters back and forth, and some of the letters are published in this war memoir that was published about Hugh Nibley. One of the letters he'd write, Paul Springer got married, and please give a platonic kiss to your poor deluded wife. Something like that. Oh, they were just merciless. You know, those are good friends.
Yep.
Here's the kicker. After all of that, later in life, and I think he was practicing law in like San Francisco, Paul Springer eventually investigated the church, was baptized. And then guess what? And then fell away after being offended by some poor bishop. Hugh Nibley responded bracingly to the disillusioned Springer, and he wrote, "Didn't you know that Mormons are as dumb as other people?
Mm.
They are not stupider, only because that is impossible. This is the Lord's work, Buster, and if it were not, I would give it 3 years to survive at the outside."
Okay, that's classic Hugh Nibley, right?
It,
Because I think it's because, as I asked the question before, he's raised outside the Mormon bubble, right? So he could go between the worlds, right? Because Mormonism is almost a counterculture in a lot of
yeah,
ways,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And he could go from UCLA and Berkeley into that bubble, but yet he had, because he spent so much time out of the bubble. I think he knew, you know what? They're just people too, and they're going to do stupid people things, and that's just part of it.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. I've often said I want to expect more of Latter-day Saints,
Sure.
right? And in the conglomerate, I think there's evidence and statistics to show not that we're better people, but there are measurable benefits to obeying the commandments, right? And
Well,
living
sure.
a good life, you know.
Sure.
In any
And
case,
look, it was something that worked for me, right? I came with no moral scaffolding whatsoever, right? And I shudder at times to think about what I would be today
yeah,
without that moral scaffolding. I mean,
I know,
honestly, honestly, like,
I know. It's scary.
whoa.
Yeah, same. But that lesson, and I've used this Hugh Nibley quotation in discussions with so many people because let's be honest, we all get disillusioned
Yes.
sooner or later with some stupid Mormon,
Yep.
or maybe we're the stupid Mormon that disillusioned somebody else, right? We have to have grace.
Yeah.
We have to be able, if we're practicing Latter-day Saints, we have to be able to forgive. I
Yeah.
mean, because we're and judging a religion by their stupidest members is never fair. You know what I'm
No,
saying?
no,
Anyway,
and here's the thing, right? Joseph even alluded to this, where he talked about, if you don't accuse me, I won't accuse you, and we'll go in
yeah,
the celestial kingdom together.
yeah, yeah, very
And
good.
so I think even Joseph recognized this, that
Oh, for
there are
sure.
people.
Joseph of all people. Oh, can you
But see,
imagine how the heartbreak of that?
I also think that Nibley, because you alluded to what an impression it left on him when Spencer Kimball bent down to clean his shoes.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that makes Nibley so interesting isn't just the scholarly work, but the application of that scholarly work, right? Because
Mm.
oftentimes
Oh, yeah.
Hugh Nibley seems to be able to, he seems to almost people watch in a way, right?
Oh, my goodness.
And
Oh,
and
yeah.
and so these sorts of things I think leave an impression on Hugh because he is an astute observer of humanity and the human condition.
That's what he called himself. You
Really?
know what how would you describe yourself? He says, I am an observer.
Okay.
And all throughout World War II, he'd ask himself, what am I doing here? I'm here to observe. And
Right.
that's what he did throughout his life. And yeah, he was and we'll see his teachings are oh, so wide ranging, so direct and so approachable and so profound all at the same time. That's going to be a lot of fun.
And the difference between Hugh Nibley and a guy like myself is that, okay, I used to work in Twin Falls, Idaho for a while, and my
Uh-huh.
office was literally around the corner from this Costco. So I'd take the Costco card and go down there and have lunch. I mean, $1.50 for a hot dog and a
Yeah.
slice of pizza, right? You can't beat it. And I would just people watch. Now Hugh would look for the fun, for the more in depth things. I was the kind of people watcher is like, why do you need an entire tub of Bengay? Like, are you really are you really that beat up that you need that? That's the difference between a guy like me and someone like Hugh Nibley. So
All right, I can't make too much of this event. Uh, this text, the question and answer, comes from a video that was made about him in 19. I think it debuted in 1986, called "Faith of an Observer," which was filmed and produced by his son. The question was asked of him: Did you always have? And so he's 75, 76 years old at this point. Did you always have a testimony of the gospel? Hugh Nibley said, except for one short period when the bottom of the world fell out.
hmm.
That was desperate. He's talking about the Great Depression, which
Well,
affected his family very, very badly. It even Charles W. Nibley, once the wealthiest man, ended up having to sell off his assets to pay his debts to
wow.
remain solvent. His father wasn't so lucky. His father was a real estate, what do they call him? A high stakes real estate guy in Los Angeles.
Speculator.
Yeah, I think he's speculative realty. Yeah, and was doing so well before the Great Depression. They were living in a mansion, But before you know it, they had to sell the mansion to pay
Mm,
debts. And he spent the rest of his life doing high risk speculative deals trying to get rich again. And it ended up costing them their marriage. They
wow.
never divorced, but they separated.
Gotcha.
And he was mom and dad. And they died like within months of each other. She in California and he in Oregon.
Gotcha.
Anyway, and he suffered from depression at that time. Question says, well, when was that? Hugh Nibley said, it came back with a bang. I was terribly bothered about this afterlife business. So to see his mind where I understand that. Why
Mhm.
would I believe in an afterlife if I have nothing to hang that on, no evidence, no facts, right?
Right.
He said, I had no evidence for that, whatever. And I remember I went up to Mount Wilson at the time. I walked around in the snow and brooded about it. And I came back. We had a meeting at the old Hollywood Ward. Matthew Cowley's father was the speaker that night.
That Matthias.
Why did he say that? And why didn't he just say Matthias Cowley? Matthew Cowley was more famous. He had
Okay.
done the Pacific Island mission and had a lot of miraculous things happen. And he was wrote books and everybody loved him, but they'd forgotten all about Matthias. And of course, Matthias Cowley was one of the apostles that fell out of favor during the Second
Hmm.
Manifesto era, and later was reinstated full blessings, but never reinstated to the Quorum of the 12. And well, in the town I grew up in, Cowley, Wyoming, was named after Matthias Cowley. Hooray!
Yep.
So I have an affinity for him, I guess. At any rate, so this was after Matthias Cowley's reinstatement. Matthias Cowley is still speaking places. Um, so he says, I went up to meet Brother Cowley. As soon as he took my hand, he says, so they'd never met before. Matthias Cowley says to Hugh as he shakes his hand, come with me. I want to give you a blessing. The blessing was the thing that had been puzzling my mind. The Lord would give me an answer immediately. What an extraordinary thing.
Wow.
Sure, that was just a coincidence or
Just a
anything.
coincidence. Just a
With,
coincidence.
within that very week, I had an appendicitis attack. So this is 1936.
Okay.
We went to the old Seventh-day Adventist hospital out in Loma Linda, and I had the appendix taken out. His wife describes it as follows. As I understand, he swallowed his tongue and actually was at one time technically dead. And of course, they realized what had happened and worked frantically and brought him back. But during that period, he had one of those life after death experiences, very much like the ones that Dr. Moody famously describes. And Hugh's going to describe his experience like this. There are things about it as you listen that are similar to other experiences and markedly different in other
Right.
ways. He says, then all of a sudden, down this thing like a tube, you get sucked down this thing and you come out. Oh boy, I know everything and everything is there. And this is what I wanted to know! Exclamation point. That there is an afterlife.
Mm.
But he
Yeah.
learned more than that. 3 cheers and all this sort of thing. I started solving problems and everything else. And then they found the resuscitator. And the doctor says, I talked to him all during the operation. I said, just because I can't move now, it looks as if I wasn't feeling this, but it hurts so much worse than I can describe. It's real, all right.
Mm.
I talked with him the whole time during the thing. And Dr. Whalen talked about that. He'd never seen anybody do anything like that. But all I wanted to know was whether there was anything on the other side. And when I came out there, I didn't meet anything or anybody else. But I looked around and not only was in all possession of my faculties, but they were tremendous. I was light as a feather and ready to go, you see. Above all, I was interested in problems. I'd missed out on a lot of math and stuff like that. How would I be able to go? Well, in 5 minutes, I could make up for that.
Wow.
Remember, as Joseph Smith said, if you could look for 5 minutes into yonder heavens, you see, forget all the rest you ever bothered about. So number
Wow.
one, he learned that the afterlife is genuine. And the second thing he figured out, is that in the world of spirits, you learn as faster than is humanly possible.
Right.
You learn as fast as you can question.
Right.
So here's his conclusions. By the way, the video "Faith of an Observer" is, you can just go onto YouTube and watch it. Very entertaining. So that gives me a great relief. That's why I don't take this very seriously down here in mortality.
Interesting.
We're just sort of dabbling around, playing around, being tested for our moral qualities. And above all, the two things that we can be good at, and no two other things can we do. We can forgive and we can repent. Period.
Interesting.
It's the gospel of repentance. We're told that the angels envy men, their ability both to forgive and to repent, because they can't do either, you see. Huh?
Wow.
Why can't angels forgive or repent? There's nothing to forgive.
Right.
They dwell in a sinless environment. And yet they want to. Why would they want to? Because that's exercising charity, the love of
Right.
Christ. If they're Christ-like beings, they want to help people.
Right.
Repent means to change. It's a godly change. Now, their angels are resurrected and they're finished changing. But why would they look back on that and think, man, that was awesome? Why would they envy that? As I pondered these questions, this experience here helped me better appreciate and hopefully try to take advantage of my mortal existence. We tend to, and I still do. I mean, I can't wait for the millennium and joining the heavenly choirs and all that sort of incredible stuff. But the truth is that the time for us to be heroes is
Is now.
now.
Wow.
And it flipped my whole perception of mortality versus eternity. Anyway, I thought that was amazing. And then he goes on. But nobody's very clever. Nobody's very brave. Nobody's very strong. Nobody's very wise. We're all pretty stupid, you see. Oh, he would laugh, just confessing the stupidity of humankind, confessing his own stupidity. Do you see how incredible this event was for him? Humbled him to the point where he was able to actually become something more. Exactly the same thing God did to Moses directly.
You know,
When he,
it's fascinating because he says it's hard to take anything serious down here. But then he goes on to produce 19 volumes of work, right? I mean, I think there's something to be gleaned there from perspective.
oh, exactly. Well, those 19 volumes, none of those, he wasn't writing any of them for fame or for fortune. I mean, there were some early ones that he would get published because of academia, and he didn't even want those to be put in his volumes. We'll talk about those next time,
Hmm.
because they weren't significant. His really significant stuff about the plan of salvation, about God, about what he called the terrible questions, those couldn't even be accepted by most journals
Right.
because they were overtly religious. Had he not had this experience, he wouldn't have been in a position to write from a position of faith instead of a position
Right.
of self-aggrandizement and pride, which is what God did to Moses. And in order for Moses to be an effective emissary, to be his prophet, Moses had to be humbled, which is why when Moses was shown the history of the whole world and the presence of God left him, he fell to the earth.
Right.
And he said, now for this cause, I know that man is nothing, which thing I had never supposed.
Hmm.
That's exactly what happened to Hugh Nibley. Smartest man alive, arguably, and he realizes how stupid he really is. And that humility is what allows us to change, to repent, and to be
Wow.
grateful. Yeah. So he goes, we're all pretty stupid, you see. Nobody's very anything. And he could laugh at himself because he knew how stupid he was. Even he knew he was doing good. He knew that.
Right.
But he saw the big picture. Nobody's very anything. We are not tested on these things, but the things the angels envy us for. We can forgive and we can repent. So 3 cheers. Let's start repenting as of now. Why haven't we read that in the scriptures? Or have we?
We have.
That's right.
We have.
Forgiveness is charity.
Yep.
Both Paul and Moroni, clearly Mormon. Yeah.
Hmm.
Speaking of charity, he that is possessed of it in the last day, it shall be well with him. Period.
Right.
But and Paul says, if you don't have charity, you're nothing. You're nothing. That's what it's about. And our capacity to learn immortality is pretty pathetic. Line upon line, precept upon precept. Apparently, in the hereafter, we don't learn line upon line, precept upon. We learn all at once. And the fact that we're so limited in our capacities here is because it forces us to focus on the only 2 things that we're really being tested for.
Wow.
The things that would allow us to be trusted by
Right.
God to give us everything
Whew.
if we possess his love and his capacity to forgive and to change, to be humble enough to change.
You know,
Everybody who knew him at that time in his life said that he was visibly changed after
yeah.
that. He was different.
The other thing I find fascinating about this account is he said the thing we're tested on is our moral qualities. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, going back to forgiveness and repentance, right?
Mm.
Um, that's an interesting perspective, right? We all run around, we all do our thing, we try to make our way in this life and provide the most comfortable living we can
Yeah.
for our family. But at the end of the day, that's not what we're judged on.
Nope.
It's the morality that we have that is the most crucial thing per Hugh and his experience.
On these 2 hang all the law and the prophets.
Yep.
Loving the Lord, the God with a heart, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. Ta-da!
Right.
If you do that, everything else will fall into line,
Right.
hopefully. This is Boyd Peterson, the author of his biography, and talking about this experience. He said this experience had a profound influence on Hugh. Certainly, education remained important to him throughout the rest of his life. However, his experience was a higher form of education that helped him recognize the most important tests in his life were not administered in the classroom. As Hugh put it, this knowledge helped him focus on life as a period when we are tested, as you said, for our moral qualities. It was a pivotal experience that served as a balance wheel for his entire life. And I think as I was preparing for this, it was before he went to war. And I think it served as kind of a shield for him to survive um, psychologically in the war because he wasn't in constant fear of death. In fact, when he was facing death at the end, he was excited because he had already been there and he knew how awesome it was.
Wow.
Here is a rundown of him at war. Look how old he looks in that photo.
Right. Yeah, it aged him significantly.
He enlists in 1942, 1943, German Order Battle Intelligence, 44, D-Day, 44, Invasion of Holland, 45, travels widely through Europe. As I was reading this account, I was mentally counting how many times he almost died or should have died. I think I stopped at a dozen. I couldn't keep track of them all. It was so much so, and everybody could see it. He was not wounded. Of the 5 uh, intelligence officers that went through the Ritchie boys that he went through with, he was the only survivor.
Man.
His regular first sergeant of the headquarters company of the 101st, Zilski, used to say, everything happens to Nibley and nothing ever happens to him.
Wow. Yeah.
For example, driving on the Utah beach, which wasn't as bad as other beaches, but he was still
Right.
getting shot at, right? He wasn't supposed to drive the drive the Jeep. He was supposed to be on one of the gliders. But his commanding officer said, no, I want to be in the glider. I mean, he was a real go-getter. Well,
Right.
he was killed. He was killed. That would have been Hugh, right? Um, the other one was when he was in the glider going into Holland. he'd get sick on the gliders, and anyway, he looked, and beside him was this piece of sheet metal that had been left on the glider, and he said, "Oh, I wonder if that would be good to sit on." So he puts it underneath him. No sooner had he put it underneath him, it took 3 rounds, 3 bullet rounds,
Oh,
which would have hit him directly, but were absorbed by that shield.
wow.
Another one that I recall, he was in a foxhole, behind enemy lines, and a German, I think it was a Mark IV, parked over his foxhole,
Oh, geez.
and he just sat there quietly until they left. I think it was in the morning.
But none of this phases him really because he's already seen the other side, right?
And to hear him describe it in his writings, or he's being interviewed by his son Alex, he said he realized this is how it is. This is how it has to be. So okay, I mean, he just accepted the reality of the situations that they were in.
Interesting.
And of course, his assurance of life after death, I have no doubt. And I don't even think he probably had to think of it at that point. It was just part of his psychology that if
Right.
I die, awesome. It's going to be awesome, right? Now, here's why Brigham Young University, I think, was a crucial part of his being able to publish like he did. Number one, at BYU, he had the resources to assemble a library of hundreds of volumes of ancient texts.
Right.
He had that support. Number two, the university uniquely allowed him time to pursue these religious studies. At another university, forget it. Publish or perish. Teach your full load. You know, can't have any students complaining about you. Which is, I'm not delegitimizing, but they recognized what his greater mission was, and they gave him the liberty to do so. So number three, the academic freedom.
Right. Because he's
To,
not going to
to
get that at Claremont or any of those other colleges.
right, right. And even at these divinity schools, like Claremont had a religious program, and Harvard and the Oriental Institute. But to take a uniquely Mormon approach to all of his studies, no. Number four, he had protection. As I and others can attest, academia can be uh, a battleground,
Right.
especially if people have an axe to grind with you. And there were those at Brigham Young University who had an axe to grind with Hugh. One of his deans said this about him: Hugh Nibley is destroying the church.
Why? Why did he say that? What was his impetus for saying that?
Hugh constantly mocked academia, constantly talking about curriculum instead of actually just teaching the stuff. And because he's unconventional in what he studies and how he writes and what he writes about, he wouldn't be a good seminary teacher, or he wouldn't be good on the curriculum committee. Those guys straight laced, as you say, and I think, and you see it in every organization, but in the church, it manifests itself as the Peter priesthoods,
Mm-hmm.
as they used to say, the stereotype, don't ask any questions, do your job kind of thing. And then we have people like Hugh Nibley and me, not in the sense of my intelligence, but in how I question things. I can't help it, and I can't suppress it. I can't lie to myself. I
Right.
have questions, and I think that's why he appealed to me so much, because he was asking the same, coming up with all these awesome answers, and not only was it okay, he was honored for it. He was recognized for that, and then suddenly I was like, hey, I'm not bad. I'm just different, and I have questions, and these could be awesome things.
Do
Anyway,
we ever do? Because look, if I'm not mistaken, Hugh kind of, as much as you can say this about a university, he attains kind of a rock star status, right?
yeah, yeah,
And I can only imagine that must have, because let's face it, we all have egos, right?
professional jealousies, of
And I
course.
can only imagine that this guy who's pretty unassuming seems to garner this celebrity, if you will, within Mormonism.
Yeah,
And
and what makes it worse,
he doesn't care about it.
he doesn't care about the regalia, he doesn't care about the status, he doesn't care about any of the stuff that they care about, and it's probably driving him crazy.
Right.
So yeah, and, and so he had protection because his former students were presidents of the institution and on the board of trustees. So if anybody came after him, they would stop it.
Right. Right. So he enjoyed a tenure in academia that often isn't afforded to people. I mean,
Yep.
look, let's use somebody who I think is a fair comparison. Maybe not as prolific in publications, but if we look at Jordan Peterson, right?
Yeah.
This is a
Yeah.
guy who gets kicked out of academia for exploring things like the Bible, right? And extracting lessons from the Bible. I'm not sure of his religious status. I don't know if he is somebody who is a believer per se, but
He is
he is he
unconventionally so. And he was kicked out. It had nothing to do with his religious
right.
studies. He was questioning the political correctness of the transgenderism and that stuff that's going on. And that's why they made him take these brainwashing classes, and it was just awful. So
Re-education,
he's out of that now.
right? But we see a guy like him who is wildly popular today, right? Not just
Yeah.
among a certain subsect of the population, but globally, and that wasn't enough to protect him, right? And so Hugh Nibley's afforded a tenure in academia that, quite frankly, is unheard of today for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's because church leadership, which kind of bleeds over into the leadership at BYU, recognized his uniqueness. And they recognized from day one. I mean, they were calling on him from 1947 on.
Hmm.
So, yeah, they were watching out for this guy. Number five, and here's another part. In academia, colleagues are the job of professors in academia is not to toot each other's horns.
Right,
What academia forces you to do is to promote yourself,
right,
publish or perish. And when you're applying for tenure promotions, you have to put together a binder of how awesome you are.
right.
Nobody does that for you. And you're so busy, it's not like you can run around and do that for other people. This is why this next the fifth point I'm trying to make is so extraordinary. Hugh Nibley's books were published by other faculty members,
Wow.
like John Welch,
Yeah.
right? And John Gee, the preeminent Egyptologist in the church right now, and all these other guys who have their own jobs, right? And they're doing their own publishing, took time to help publish Hugh Nibley's works because they felt this. I mean, he was their teacher, he was their inspiration. I mean, that's extraordinary
Yeah.
and Christ-like in a very big way.
Yeah. Can you relate the story about him and Truman Madsen and about the naming of the series or whatever? Because I think that one is huge. That one to me, I remember watching that one on a video. Um, and
Yeah.
to me, that was who Hugh Nibley was.
So in 1983, and I'll skip ahead just a little bit, Farms is organized. The impetus behind that, one of the reasons that happened, was the president of BYU at the time was Jeffrey Holland, who's a scholar. And Truman Madsen had been behind the publication of the volume of Nibley essays that predates the collected works, called Nibley on the Timely and Timeless. And this is the book we're talking about. But that was published, and that's the first one I read. And I was like, oh my, I mean, I've been reading the essays in essay form, but that book, amazing. Anyway, so President Jeffrey Holland, president of the university, reads it. And he says to Truman Madsen, let's see, he suggested to Truman Madsen that a second volume of Nibley on the Timely and Timeless might be welcome. Let's have two.
Right.
After that, we get 19. He said, as I look at the Nibley corpus, wrote Holland, it seems to me unfortunate that more of those are not available. Is there any way in which a second volume might be pursued? He asked. So
Mm,
anyway, so to show you how little Hugh Nibley cares about self-aggrandizement and that sort of thing. And this was back before, I mean, when printing and the galley proofs and all stuff were done without the aid of computers predominantly, right?
right.
And Truman Madsen wanted to surprise Hugh Nibley. So he didn't ask him about the title. He said, oh, he's going to love it. Invites Hugh Nibley over and he lays out the galley proofs on the table and all this sort of stuff. And Nibley had a cow. He freaked. You cannot call it this. And, oh, they were going to call it the Nibley Legacy.
Yeah.
He said, you cannot call it this. Legacy makes it sound like I'm dead. And I don't want my name in it. It was all about that sort of stuff. And of course, the galley proofs are all done. It was ready
Right.
to go to print. And Truman Madsen was adamant. He says, Hugh, we're going to have to change all of this. It's going to take weeks. It's going to cost over $1,000 in that day. Hugh's response was, take it out of my royalties. And Truman Madsen said, do you really care that much about a title? And Hugh Nibley says, no, I care that little about royalties. And so it was changed to Nibley on the Timely and Timeless instead of Hugh Nibley Legacy or something, or Legacy of Hugh Nibley.
Interesting.
Yeah. And finally, the trust of the church leaders. So he was protected and allowed and given time and leeway to do things that other professors would never get to do.
Right.
Yeah. 46, he marries Phyllis Draper. There they are with their kids. How did he feel about his wife? So he was bedridden for like at least the last 2 years of his life, which
Okay.
was impossibly difficult for him because he was very active physically, mentally, verbally, and it was hard for him to talk and he couldn't write, just stuck in this bed watching CNN all day, right? And his son says this about him, son-in-law. What was left in that hospital bed in the weeks prior to his death was nothing but love, because he was forced for the first time in his life to put all these other things aside and focus on the people around him.
Right.
When one visitor asked him a probing question about the definition of love, Hugh pointed to Phyllis, his wife, who had consecrated so much of her life to her husband's work and who now waited on his every need. She was his caretaker, and he simply said, there she is. So what's the definition of love? There she is.
You know, whether it's me in this podcast or you and writing this book and jumping on here and having all these podcasts with me, the meetings we attend for our various religious activities, I couldn't do any of this without my wives. Not a single solitary bit
Yep.
without their support. And if we think of just how prolific Hugh Nibley was, there must have been a bond between the two of them that was unbreakable, right? We ask women to do hard things, right? Whether you're a guy like me or not, we ask them to allow the world to have access to us, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and that doesn't come cheap.
No.
And so often we talk about the men and their legacies and what they left behind. And so often I find myself wondering, what was the home life like? Right? But there must have been something there for her to say he's not going into a convalescent home. He's going to stay right here with me, and I will take care of him. Oftentimes, the wives of guys just don't get the credit that they deserve.
Oh, clearly not. I mean, that's motherhood and matriarchy is based on, it's founded on service. The greatest of all is the servant of all, says Christ. And
Right.
nobody serves the family more than the person who gives birth
Yeah.
and rears and raises these children to maturity. Oh my goodness. In her case, she would actually do some proofing and editing of his work. So she was in it with him, which was
Right.
awesome. You know, that she had that kind of investment. She had staked her in that. So uh, now his family life. And you can imagine his focus made him a little bit difficult to live with. It is said that when he went to bed every night, there's only a couple times he didn't bring a book to bed.
Right.
You know, good night, honey. Thanks. I'm going to be reading myself to sleep. Kind of a thing.
Right.
Um, and he was preoccupied with that stuff. And I falsely assumed that he was maybe an absentee father, and they just had to put up with it. I was very pleased to discover that is not the case.
Mm.
His daughter Christina says, despite or perhaps because of his childlike awe at the beauties of nature and his constant preoccupation with discovering the ancient past, Dad could be a difficult man to live with, especially for our mother, who was his partner for 58 years. He was a man who loved children, however, and together they had 8 of us. Daddy especially loved babies and toddlers and was actually quite a helpful babysitter
Mm.
and labor saver when there were several little ones at a time running loose in the house. He changed thousands of diapers in his lifetime. There are a lot of dads who won't change them at all. And
Right.
he wasn't using disposable diapers.
Yeah. Yeah.
To me, that speaks volumes about a
Absolutely.
guy who will do that. Love his kids. The best tribute I ever read about him was this one that I'm going to read next from his daughter, Rebecca. She said, oh, how I loved my father. He was my hero. The smartest, funniest, wittiest, wisest, silliest, sweetest man I knew.
Mm.
If my daughter had those feelings for me, I would be the happiest man alive. And
Absolutely.
I tried so hard. I want her to know how incredible she is and how important she is to me. One of his daughters, she was like 5. He would take his kids on hikes with him. I love this one photo. I don't think I included it. Was he and his 5 sons. He was holding the hands of 2 of them from behind, walking through this, walking down this trail together. He and his 5 little boys.
Mm.
Anyway,
You know, to go along with that, when I die, if the thing that's said about me is he was a good surveyor or he had a great podcast on owner, that's what I'm remembered for. I'm gonna be so pissed. Right? I'm gonna be so pissed. Because at the end of the day, it's my family I care about most. And look, the rest of the world could hate me. And that's okay, as long as the people that I love the most know that I loved them.
yeah.
That's all I care about. That's all I care about. And I think from what you're describing, Hugh, here, Nibley was much the same way.
Or in reverse, I'm trying to remember who said it. David O. McKay, I think. No worldly success can compensate for failure in the home.
Yep. Yep. 100%.
Fame, fortune, you name it. If I failed my kids, and boy, when they're little, you just so fall in love with them.
Oh, yeah.
And then you like them, and then you admire them as adults, and even though they make mistakes and stuff. Uh, if I, I remember saying this to myself, God help me if I ever do anything to harm my children in any way.
Yeah. Yep. 100%. I'm there with you, Ken.
You talked about farms. I was going to tell you about his daughter, I think it was Zina, Zina is her name.
Dinah.
He
Yep.
took her camping. She's like 5 years old.
Okay.
They were in this basin. They were camping at the bottom of this basin. She wakes up in the morning and her father's gone, which scared her, and she came out of the tent. Suddenly, he comes scrambling down the side of the hill, scoops her up in his arm, and takes her up to the top of the hill again, so that she could see the sunrise with him.
Mm.
And what she realized, what he had done, he'd gone up to the top of the rim of the bowl of the basin, so he could photograph his daughter down at the campsite.
Oh.
Isn't that interesting? I
Yeah.
just, I thought, the way he was focused and hyper focused on his work, I thought maybe he's like on the autism scale, but to see his humanity with his children, no, he was
Right.
all there, and that he was, I mean, really functional in that regard. So from 1980 onward, Hugh Nibley and the fledgling Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies had been joined at the hip. He was happy to have his name listed as a member of the farm's board when it began to mail out periodic newsletters in 1981. I was some of the first people to get those
Hmm.
right after my mission. Farm soon began offering Xerox copies of significant articles about the Book of Mormon in a series called the Farm's Reprints. That was like those are the happiest day when I'd get those in the mail. Ah, more Nibley. Several of Nibley's hard to find articles were distributed among these reprints. That was a day before digital copies, email, or the widespread availability of the internet. The demand for these reprints was truly modest by today's standards, but for its day, the number of copies made and conveniently mailed out was phenomenal
Wow.
and sensational. Yeah, I was so cool. And then they sent out this little catalog you could order from. By 1982, Farms had issued a catalog of articles, which it sent free to its mailing list. And these articles you could buy for like $1. So guys like me could afford it back then. Soon thereafter, the organization established the goal of bringing together all of Hugh's collected works. As Welch puts it, he knew what farms needed to build directly on he knew that farms needed to build directly on the scholarly work of Hugh Nibley, who had taught many of us as students. And we knew that our future was closely aligned with his past
Wow.
because their work were based upon the things that
Yeah,
he was
he was
writing
the
about.
first guy, right? Everybody stands on his shoulders in this field of study.
Yep, yep, I so absolutely agree. So you can see the publication dates. They start in 1986, and when we talk about his teachings in specific, we'll talk about the publication dates, and that's 19 volumes over 24 years. So they were busy, almost
Right.
a volume per year, right? And that was pretty serious. So here's this unknown quantity of research.
Well,
So he loved especially that he had a chance many times to do assignments anonymously. Speaking to Zina, he told me once that the projects he contributed to that were the most worthwhile were those that he could not take credit for.
interesting.
Like you, like, so what were they?
I want him so bad.
Yeah. And I love this. When asked how he was able to accomplish the prodigious work he did, this is his son Thomas, his answer was often a single word, prayer. And then, on rare occasions, I also heard him mention that he had, quote, a private arrangement with the other side, which he thoroughly enjoyed,
Wow.
unquote. That's all we know about that.
Huh.
This is what I mentioned earlier. There's a photograph of him with his Underwood typewriter. His
Gee.
recommendation on the first digital LDS library in 1997 was, I wish I'd had this 40 years ago. Could you imagine
Oh,
what
yeah.
he could have done?
Yep. I can only imagine what he must be thinking on the other side as someone goes through his works online and just types in a keyword search and
Yeah.
it's like, you cheaters, you cheaters.
Yeah, maybe. On the other hand, I think he's delighted.
Yeah.
You and I can do this,
Yep.
and that we can talk about the truths that he lived, that he discovered, and that he shared and expounded upon with so many free of charge. It was never about the money for him. Never. He didn't care about that.
Right.
Did not care.
Mm.
Eh, well, so that's it. Save the 10,000 pages of his teachings.
So let me ask you this in conclusion. Let me ask a few questions here before I get to there. Do you ever have you come across anything at which Nibley feels like maybe he feels like there was something more he could have done, right? Is there any inclination that he's like, "Oh, I messed this up," or "I didn't do anything like that"? And I asked the question not to deride Hugh Nibley,
Oh no, that's
but
a wonderful question.
it's sometimes we tend to turn these kind of guys into marble statues, right?
Right.
And we don't do them justice because if we don't see their humanity, and we've seen his humanity here, but sometimes your humanity is best on display when you feel like you've fallen short of something.
He was the first one to confess that his works would go out of date or be superseded by something. Well, when we read about his teaching, he was the first to say science is self-correcting. Things change. He
Wait,
was,
was he saying the science is never settled?
yeah, something like that.
Huh,
Yes,
weird.
in very fun ways. And he said the same thing. He didn't expect that his works were not scripture. He knew that. He
Right.
knew they would be superseded. He knew they might become outdated. There was one point, and I did a specific search through his library for Adam God references. He mentioned it once in speaking about man's relationship to God and to the pre-Adamites, the
Right.
humanoid. And he said something about our relationship with God uh, relative to Adam God. He says, but I'm not prepared to talk about that right now. And he didn't
I've
talk
heard
nothing.
I've heard some interesting stories. Because okay, so now I'm going to go a little bit fundy here, so bear with me.
Well, we know he loved and revered Brigham Young, so we know that he knew that Brigham Young believed it. So go on.
There is there was a prominent um there was a prominent author within fundamentalism. And I don't want to say the name because quite frankly, I want to get permission that it would be okay, and I didn't.
Chicken,
What's that?
chicken.
All right, fine. You call me chicken. It's on. Ogden Kraut.
I knew that would work.
Og, yeah, I'm a simple man. Okay, I
Yeah.
like steak. I like football, and I'm easily baited. Okay. Um, if I'm not mistaken, he'd even talked to certain fundamentalists that he felt were scholarly, which you had to respect, right?
Oh yeah.
From my camp, the guy's just an honest dealer, right? You got questions,
Yeah.
you can talk to him. He'll
Oh
talk to
yeah.
you, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's why even today, like right now, one of the big things that I know is being read in my faith community is approaching Zion, right?
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
so his work has a way of spanning really Brighamite tradition, if you want to use that word, right?
Oh gosh, he revered he revered the
Yeah.
teachings and of Brigham Young, and we're going to talk about one of those Brigham Young essays. And he says, and he
Can't wait.
calls out people who tend to marginalize the teachings of Brigham Young. He says
Yeah.
Brigham Young, he was Joseph Smith's most devoted disciple
Yep.
who learned at the feet of Joseph.
Well,
We need to take his works, his words and his teaching more seriously.
right. So let me say this, right? Because I do think that in some ways Nibley might feel a certain kinship to Brigham. You called him
Oh
the
yeah,
you called him the expounder, right?
yeah,
And
Yeah.
if you look at a lot of what Brigham Young taught, not everything, but a vast, vast majority of it, he simply expounds upon what Joseph had already taught. He was an expounder. And
I
and
agree.
because unlike Joseph, who, look, they were ready to lynch that dude over a new set of scripture that on the surface, a very surface reading, seems kind of Trinitarian, right?
Yeah.
Um, they were ready to lynch him over that. Can you imagine trying to preach, things out of the King Follett discourse, plural marriage, those sorts of things? They'd have hammered him in a heartbeat. When
Yeah.
Brigham gets out west, he doesn't have any of those same issues. He
Yeah.
can
He's cut loose. Yeah.
freely, and he can expound on that. So I'm just guessing no one should take this as gospel by any stretch of the imagination, but rationally I think that he probably looks at Brigham and feels a kinship, because just as Nibley's an expounder, so was Brigham Young.
Well, the other thing they have in common is their directness.
Yes.
The thing that, and we'll study the essay we're going to look at by Hugh Nibley is educating the saints.
Yeah. Yep.
Um, and and I tell you, if you don't appreciate Brigham Young's directness, and it wasn't mean, it was just direct, and it was kind of, I mean, it was like you would talk to your neighbors and stuff,
Right.
and that was the rhetorical style, frankly, of that time period. He was so good at it, and everything Brigham Young said was extemporaneous,
Right.
incredible when you see what
Yep.
he says.
Yep.
Yes, you will find contradictions in what he says, but he's the most recorded prophet of the era.
Yep.
We have far more, and and then we have the J.D. Watt transcriptions, and do they really say exactly what he said? No, they don't. We know that, but it's still the best that we have, and
Yeah.
it's still profound. And so I love the directness of Brigham Young, and Hugh Nibley is very direct. And
Yep.
so I think so. So in that essay, you'll be reading Brigham Young, and then Hugh Nibley will interject, and it's easy to get them confused
Absolutely.
because neither of them are beating around the bush.
Nope.
And uh, Brigham Young has rightfully been called by American historians as the American Moses.
Absolutely. And
That's
rightfully so.
that's huge.
Yep. Yep.
That's
Absolutely.
huge. And he was made of sterner stuff. Uh, that is absolutely, when you know anything about the Exodus
Yeah.
to the Salt Lake Valley, then you had to be tough as nails to do that, and
Absolutely.
you had to guide with a firm hand
Yep.
to
Yeah.
make that happen.
You had to be able to chew on steel a little bit and spit it back out. I mean, that's just all there was to it. But
And I'll tell you what, and you had to be rock solid in his testimony of the foundation and of
absolutely.
its founding prophet and time. And you can't. Brigham Young wasn't perfect, and I've heard you say he's not your God. We know that, but he was unquestionably, and
Right.
history vindicates this. He was the man for the job. He
Look,
was the prophet for that time period.
here's what I'll say, right? And I'm gonna tie this back to Nibley. There is a big push right now among some thought in Mormonism. I'm looking at you, the DOC crowd, who wants to unhinge from Brigham Young. You cannot do that. Brigham is second only to Joseph Smith, in my estimation, for the continued success of the restoration. If
True.
you unhitch from Brigham Young, you know what you don't have? You do not have, quite frankly, sealings as we know them today.
Yep.
Plural or monogamist, right? Because they weren't expounding D&C 132 in Nauvoo because it was too dangerous.
Yep.
It's only in the Utah period where that comes into focus and becomes canon.
Well, in Joseph Smith, and we've talked about this, who realized that the end game, the ultimate goal of the restoration was the salvation of all mankind through
Yep.
vicarious works, and he entrusted one person
Yep.
with that in the end. One.
Systematize and organize the endowment.
Yeah.
That was
Finish it.
yes.
Finish it. It
Yep.
is not, he's told him it is not finished. It's not organized. Finish it, Brigham.
Yep.
And he did.
Yep. And then when it comes, let me tie this back to Hugh Nibley. Just like you can't unhinge from Brigham, I don't think you can unhinge from Nibley when it comes to the scholarly pursuit of Mormonism. Certainly, we all feel this in our core, but as I think we'll see next time, Nibley's teachings have permeated all of Mormonism in a way that, quite frankly, is on par with many of the past prophets of the
That's
restoration.
true. And we don't even understand the full uh, uh the the full consequences of that because we don't know what his anonymous teachings, his anonymous
Right.
research was, right? But
Absolutely.
that we know that that has informed the church leadership because they asked that of him. That's amazing.
Yep.
An
Yep.
integral part of that.
Absolutely.
And the whole trying to unhitch from any character in your past, whether they're good or whether is evil, is of the devil.
Yep.
Section 93 makes as to anything more or less. Truth is a knowledge of things as they are, as they were, and as they are to come. Anything more or less than this is the spirit of that evil one, of the devil, who is a liar from the beginning.
Yep.
So when you revisionist history is of the devil.
Yep. Absolutely.
People ignorant of the history are doomed to repeat it. Was Brigham Young a racist? Yeah, far less than anybody of his time. Less of a racist than Abraham Lincoln, even, believe it or not.
Yep. Yep.
But boy, but he was a good man.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, people would look at us. What kind of a monster was that Dave guy?
Oh,
Ken Peterson, what a clown, right?
dude, years from now,
But
if
we're
we
trying to do good things, right?
if we make it that far, right? I have no doubt
Yeah.
my great grandkids will be like, the old man was a savage, right? Like, of that I have no doubt. But dude, this was fun. Um, I think people are gonna be super stoked for next week's when we get into the teachings.
I have to. I'm scared. I'm more scared for this because. Well, here's the other thing. I know how many people. Well, I don't know exactly how many, but I know people revere the work, the life of Hugh Nibley for the same reasons I do, and then some. And yet here I am. Yeah. What is it? What's it saying? Fools rush in where angels fear to tread.
Yeah, yeah.
Ken Peterson, he's going to try and introduce 10,000 pages of the teachings of Hugh Nibley. But I think I have a good sampling. I'm super excited because, oh my goodness, 19 volumes, and that every volume is utterly unique.
Yep.
It shows the breadth of his genius and his diligence. And wow, it's super fun and funny. He was so funny.
Yeah.
It'll
No,
be awesome.
good stuff. All right, man. I'll see you next week.
Thanks, Dave.
All right. Bye, everybody.